Hi, my name is Steve Stanchfield, and I'm a professor here at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, Michigan. I've been working here teaching animation for a bunch of years, but before that, I worked on a lot of animated games, Warner Brothers Space Jam feature, tons of television shows, and even more commercials. One of the fun things about working in animation is that you never know exactly what you're going to be doing. It's always a little bit different. One of the things that I've loved about teaching here is that there isn't really one style of animation that happens. There's all kinds of different stuff. And some of it is pretty high tech, but almost everything just starts with drawing. We're going to do a demo today, and by the end you'll have something that you can follow and even take along with you. We're going to go really low tech for this, so you don't need any special equipment. There's a whole series of principles in character animation and in animation in general. And rather than do a sort of tutorial approach and kind of look at all of those, I'm going to be mentioning some of those as we move forward and as we produce this. This is a little demo of a character turning around. You won't really need any special tools except a pencil and some 8.5 by 11 paper. Usually animation paper is registered by a series of punches if you're working traditionally. But in this case, we're just going to use the corners of the paper to do our registration. Feel free to try this demo with different characters. I'm going to draw a very simple character with simple shapes. You don't have to follow that. You can use your own style of drawing. But my suggestion is that you don't take those drawings much further than just simple shapes for now. Let's get the action working. Let's make it animate well before worrying about making the drawings very pretty. All right, let's start. So let's do a demo of a character turning around. I think there's a couple things to just think about at first. When you're designing, design with the idea that the action will work a lot like the drawing will. So if you're drawing something that's really rubbery, it probably moves pretty rubbery. If you're drawing something that's more realistic or something that has sharp edges, it probably doesn't move in a squishy sort of way. So designing so that you have the ability to have some movement always is helpful. I like to think about weight in doing almost anything. And I often think about weight pushing or pulling on something. So if you've got a character who's like balancing themselves on one leg, either precarious or otherwise, then all the weight is going into the one leg. Things that are organic tend to move in round ways. They tend to push and pull in round ways rather than just straight up and down. If you want something to be really stiff or if you want something to have mechanical movements, keep all the movements working straight or working similar. So if a character came down, let's say your character is a robot, if they came down in one direction, they're probably going to go back up in the exact direction. There's probably not a whole lot of change there. But since we're working with something organic, and even if you're working with a character that's a little bit more realistic, consider making the action work in a rounded sort of way. Since we're doing a demo and we're trying to get through it without taking too much time, we'll keep our design ideas really simple. Frequently in animation, especially in sort of old school animation, there's often just a handful of really basic shapes. If you're working a little more complicated than this, you can use these same ideas, but you don't necessarily have to make everything into exactly the same shapes. You could box some of the stuff off a little bit, and you could work with box shapes to design. I think having a gestural approach in your animation really does help. So if you think about all of this as just being rough lines, rather than necessarily having to make a finished, complete form, it sure makes your life easier. Let's plan out a little exercise here where we're having a character turn around. What I'm going to do right now is a series of quick thumbnails. Thumbnails are usually used to help an artist interpret what they're about to do, whether it's a storyboard or working out action or working out a personality moment with a character. In this case, I'm just going to use the thumbnails very quickly to try to establish how I want to think about the scene. In this one, I think I'm going to have a character looking really hard in one direction. as if they're really scared of something. I'm using a quick line of action even in my thumbnail to kind of determine kind of how I think about it. And rather than worry about making this perfectly sequential, I'm going to play around with a variety of quick poses just to try to figure out what I might want. So I'll often do these really fast, sort of following one idea, and just kind of see where that might go. Sometimes a good idea will come out of it, and a bunch of the time I'll end up drawing the same drawing over and over again. But once I sort of have the direction I want, then I know kind of where I want to go, and I can start doing my character layout or my character key poses. I'm starting to like this disappointed pose. I think I like the direction that's going, sort of the idea that the character is really dejected already at the beginning of the scene. Of course, if you have storyboards, then you already have something to kind of work from. Oh, I'm kind of liking that. He's none too happy today. So we're going to use the edges of the paper to kind of line things up. So rather than use the peg bar that's on this particular peg, we're just going to line things up this way. So every time you make a new drawing, you can sort of tap these together and check it. I have a light behind here right now, but you could animate very successfully without even having that light. You could just use the paper to flip. Often I won't put the light on while animating anyway. I'll put it on after I've already got down my first rough version. I'm going to put a line of action into the drawing first, kind of based on where I was. Again, try this method of this sort of rapid drawing method of animating as you are first doing animation. I think that one of the things that you'll find is you end up caring about the drawing a little bit less, so it becomes a little bit easier to toss a whole thing that isn't quite working. Early on in my career, I always had trouble doing that. I'd always get upset when something wasn't working. I'd just erase and erase and erase. Sometimes it's better to just abandon. Now, digitally, of course, it's much easier to abandon something pretty quickly. This is a pretty rubbery guy here. So one of the techniques in traditional animation, drawn animation, that works pretty well is flipping drawings. I'll almost always try to figure out where the weight is, and I'll base my next drawing on that. So I'm kind of figuring out where the action's going without having really much of a drawing out at all. Just trying to figure out kind of where it's going. In this case, all the weight is coming straight down. So I think I'm going to have him straight down and curve a little to the front. Different parts of a character can be timed differently. So in this case, I'm going to time the body a little faster than the head. So the head's going to fall behind as the action's happening. This is what's called breakup of action. And it's a way to keep things kind of looking organic and loose and having kind of a fun look to it. Some things you don't want to make loose because it'll just turn it into jello. But sometimes it's a lot of fun to kind of do different breakup. What I'm doing right now is doing animation key drawings without really worrying exactly how they're timed. I'll have some idea of where I'm going as I go, but I'm not really so committed to it. It's kind of whatever happens. Now I could have thumbnailed out further. I ended up just thumbing out a first pose, sort of with the idea of just letting this particular piece of animation just kind of go where it goes. It's kind of experimental in that way. I'm holding the bottom of the paper here and flipping the top of it just to kind of see how the action is working. If you use some of these techniques digitally, you can do the same thing, and some programs that will let you see the drawings before and after, which is called onion skinning. I've always preferred, especially in my quick rough animation, to not even worry about where it's going exactly in terms of getting arcs right, anything, but rather to get the basic action in first. It's kind of a gestural approach to it, and you end up with drawings that don't necessarily always look like drawings, but you'll often get a lot of happy accidents happening in your animation because you haven't worried that much about making sure it was perfect. If I'm making sure it's perfect and trying to get to a key pose or that, pretty frequently I get a little bit stiffer. One of the really fun things about animating in this fashion in the happy accidents is that sometimes you'll see a happy accident that doesn't quite work, but then it leads you to doing something else that kind of does. Now I've thrown all of the weight down into the feet here. Now I'm just going to draw a shape for where the body is briefly. I'll usually spend a little bit more time on this, especially working out where weight is pushing or pulling, because once I establish that, then it becomes a lot easier to figure out where to pull the character. In this case, I'm just winging it. This character's pretty unhappy. Things that move the same and move in the same direction, often you can get a nice flow of action, but things that move like an accordion seem to work better. So if I pushed the character's head into the body even further, then now I have something to spring it back out of. With the gestural approach, you can often get down pretty quickly kind of what you want. If you can figure out kind of where you're going in a handful of lines, it becomes easy to dab this back and to figure out how to make a drawing out of it. I'm throwing all the weight down onto this foot, so the character is going to push off this foot and turn around and take a little jump, I think. This is pretty typical squash and stretch kind of action. I'll sometimes only look at 2 or 3 drawings rather than flip a whole bunch, because I already kind of knew where I was going direction-wise. I'm going to play around with a little smear here and have the actions moving so fast that it's actually distorting the character's face. It was discovered in the early days of film that the camera wasn't going as fast as action was, so that you would get frames that weren't capturing the image completely clearly. Rather, you'd get frames that were sort of smeary. Animation sort of takes advantage of this idea, as well as using squash and stretch, by often using a sort of a smear or a distortion in the drawing. Let's see where I'm going. So everything's squashed together. So now the idea is to try to let the whole thing pull apart. And I think I'm going to let his head lead the action. So I'm going to let the head really lead everything, and everything else has to follow it. So rather than having everything get there at the same time, I'm going to have the head pull up. I'm trying to figure out where it's going. I have him squashed down. I think I'm going to have him pull up like this. And I'm going to let the hands trail behind it and let the body trail behind it. So all of the weight is going into this front leg and it's pushing, but I'm letting the head pull first to try to get most of the action happening with the head. The character's going to be really surprised turning around. Whatever it is, it's horrifying. So it's kind of nice to know what it is, actually. But you can come up with what the best mood is that way. So if its head's leading the action and it's bringing the rest of the body up with it, then at some point the head is going to reach its top peak, and then everything else catches up. Working in this kind of exercise is pretty helpful because you'll find out right away the things that weren't working. And you'll probably also be able to see where weight is going and where it isn't going. Let's flip and see where we are. You can see we're pretty rough right now on it. But we've got most of the basic ideas of how the action will work in the scene. It's a good way to start if you want to get some nice, quick, loose roughs in. You also don't feel bad about throwing it out if it's not quite working. So there's a really quick demo on how to do some quick character animation. One of the things that I really like about doing this sort of thing fast is you get to see your results pretty fast. And especially when you're learning, you can revise or you can change the whole thing entirely. I'll sometimes do little experimental pieces like this for fun and just kind of work out some aspects of action. I found thinking in this way makes it a lot easier to try to produce character animation that has fluidity. So now it's time to do one yourself. Design a character, or if you have a character that you've already designed and that you've been working with, see if you can break them down into the simplest possible elements. Those may be circles, they may be other shapes, but find a shape language that you're comfortable with and make it really simple. Then work on having that character turn around in some emotional state. They're happy, sad, they have anxiety, or they're really worried about what might be behind them. Then do quick thumbnails, very quick thumbnails, and determine a few poses that you'd like to include. Then take a quick look at the thumbnails and have at it. Good luck with your animation.